Okay. First reading this morning is from Psalm 138. I give thanks to you with all my heart, Lord. I sing your praise before all other gods. I bow toward your holy temple and thank your name for your loyal love and faithfulness, because you have made your name and word greater than anything else. On the day I cried out, you answered me. You encouraged me with inner strength. Let all the earth's rulers give thanks to you, Lord. When they hear what you say, let them sing about the Lord's way, because the Lord's glory is so great. Even though the Lord is high, he can still see the lowly, but God keeps his distance from the arrogant. Whenever I am in deep trouble, you make me live again. You send your power against my enemy's wrath. You save me with your strong hand. The Lord will do all this for my sake. Your faithful love lasts forever, Lord. Don't let go of what your hands have made. Second reading is from Exodus chapter 1, 1 through 13. These are the names of the Israelites who came to Egypt with Jacob, along with their households: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. The total in Jacob's family was 70. Joseph was already in Egypt. Eventually, Joseph, his brothers, and everyone in his generation died. But the Israelites were fertile and became populous. They multiplied and grew dramatically, filling the whole land. Now a new king came to power in Egypt who didn't know Joseph. He said to his people, "The Israelite people are now larger in number and stronger than we are. Come on, let's be smart and deal with them. Otherwise, they will only grow in number. And if war breaks out, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and then escape from the land." As a result, the Egyptians put foremen of forced work gangs over the Israelites to harass them with hard work. They had to build storage cities named Pithom and Ramses for the Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they grew and spread, so much so that the Egyptians started to look at the Israelites with disgust and dread. So the Egyptians enslaved the Israelites. They made their lives miserable with hard work, making mortar and bricks, doing field work, and by forcing them to do all kinds of cruel work.
Thank you, Mike. Now, a new king came to power in Egypt that did not know Joseph. And so our story begins. This verse is one of the most important verses in the Bible. At least I think it is. It's so because it's a pivot point. It's a place of radical change in the trajectory that often gets overlooked in our normal 3-year cycle of reading the lectionary. The traditional reading will have what Mike read, but it will continue and include the story of Shiphrah and Puah, the most amazing women in the whole Bible. Come next week, I'm going to tell their story. And the birth of Moses. But they get a story all on their own. They'll get a week all on their own. This week, I just want to look at the beginning, because we know with any birth story, there is a story of labor that precedes it. And this is the story of the labor. The birth pangs, if you will, began 400 years earlier. Talk about a long labor. That's a long labor. But they begin with the birth of the man named Joseph, and that was the guy, Joseph, the one that Pharaoh didn't know. Joseph was the 11th son of Jacob, born with his beloved wife, Rachel. So he held a place in his father's heart. And if you know anything about Joseph, you might know about his coat, right? That Technicolor coat, that fancy coat that made him stand out. And he loved, so the scriptures say, to stand out. He lauded himself over his brothers, and so much so that they were willing to kill him to get rid of daddy's arrogant pet. He's always the favorite. So they plot and they scheme and they are ready to commit fratricide when Reuben, the eldest, steps forward and suggests an alternative solution. We'll just sell him. Done and dusted. Problem solved. When some passing Midianite traders come along, and so for 20 pieces of silver, Joseph is sold. Joseph ends up in Egypt and makes a name for himself. It's a convoluted story. It's a long story, but a time came when the Pharaoh had asked Joseph for some advice. And so Joseph gave him advice. And the Pharaoh was wise to heed it because Joseph said, we have plenty right now, but that won't last. So in the face of impending hunger, let's prepare. Because of Joseph's foresight and the Pharaoh's wisdom to listen, there was grain when truly hunger and famine ravaged the land. There was enough to feed the multitude and more. In gratitude for saving him, the Pharaoh, right? He's the one in charge, saving his face and the nation. Pharaoh gave Joseph rank and reward. No one should ever forget how thankful they were to Joseph, who had saved more than the day. He had saved the Egyptian people. But famine, as you know, does not know boundaries. And sure enough, back in Canaan, where Joseph was from, his brothers were experiencing food insecurity. And they went to Egypt looking for salvation. And a long story short, they found it in the hands of their enslaved brother. Joseph was eventually magnanimous and welcomed his brothers and the whole family, which meant, of course, as scripture tells us, more than just the father and his brothers. It was the whole family. 70 were there, wives and children, servants and all. They came and they ate and they stayed. They stayed and their children stayed and their grandchildren stayed and their great-grandchildren stayed, and so on for generations. For more than 400 years, they stayed in the land. Now, that would be about 20 generations, give or take. And they say that if you have one couple in 20 generations, they will have about 1 million descendants. And we had 70 people for 20 generations. That's a lot of people. Now, give or take who did and didn't have babies and all that kind of thing. And there was more, so there's more than one couple, and they were good at one thing, for sure. They were good at making babies. 1 million descendants from one couple. This multitude of descendants become a problem for Pharaoh. I think you might agree with me that history is not static. There's not just a set of events. It changes the further away we are from events. This is because there's more events to remember, and some just become more important events than the preceding ones. It's also my experience that events shift in their memorial weight, if you will. If we look back from the present, that earth-shattering event in junior high that you would never be able to go to school tomorrow for. Oh, it was so horrible. Do you remember that event? Only if you work at it, right? And now if you look back at it, you go, yeah, in the scope of world history, it's probably not going to make the textbook, right? But in that moment, it had weight. And so our story with Pharaoh It's that same kind of a story where in one moment it had weight. Joseph saved everybody. And 400 years, give or take, lots of things that happened, that memory no longer carries the same weight. That famine all those years ago was a distant memory. And now all the Pharaoh saw were Israelites everywhere. And that's when fear set in. The fear that if left unchecked, these foreigners, these outsiders, mind you, they've been there for how many years? 400, still outsiders. They might become so many that they would rise up either with an enemy or even without the enemy. This fear echoes across generations and is very real and very destructive. It sees people as others. It allows those in power to exploit people, to dehumanize them, to diminish them, and to do all things possible to destroy them without getting called out on the destruction. So the text says the Egyptians enslaved the Israelites. They made their lives miserable with hard work, making mortar and bricks, doing field work, and forcing them to do all kinds of other cruel work. The goal? Make fewer of them. But it didn't work. The Israelites grew in number, and so did the fear. And that's where our story begins of Moses. It begins in the fear of others, and it recognizes in an ancient story read today our ability to be inhumane to others. We have seen this same story throughout the ages. One genocide after another, one xenophobic action after another. Keep those people out, or at least under control. That's what the Armenian genocide is. That's what the Holocaust is. That's what Jim Crow is. That's what the Trail of Tears is. That's what racial profiling and redlining is. That's what the school to prison pipeline is. That's what the 13th Amendment is. Enslavement, live and well. We don't need to go far to recognize the destructive fear of others. Read the paper, listen to the news, and you will see that this ancient is a current story. And in midst of this travail, where can we find hope and possibility then in God's abundant love if it hasn't changed since then? Where's the hope? I think the hope is when we spend time to look at the pivot, to the change from neighbor to enslaved, and then from enslaved to freedom that will unfold in the story over the next few weeks. It's a pivot from fear to a fruitful future. We're going to follow this story of the prolific Israelites, and it's through their lens that we'll see the future unfold. And we'll be able, I hope, to make some parallel connections to our lives in this time and this place, but it's from their place. At the bottom of the pyramid, literally, right? That's what they were building. And figuratively, if we look at the structure, it is no joke, no like little fluke that a pyramid structure and the pyramids is what they lived in. Right? One or two at the top and everybody else at the bottom. Doesn't happen now, does it? I'll let you think about that. But we're going to look from their place at the bottom of the pyramid of power and position as they cry out and step out, or maybe better, stumble and wander out into a future. I think in those 400 years, they remembered deep down whose they were and who they were. And this set them out amongst all the Egyptians. They were known for who they were. You and I know the power, that the way those in power shape identity to their benefit. Perhaps the Israelites began to believe they were lazy, good for nothing, and they deserved what they got. But there were stories. stories they held and stories they told to one another of a God who made promises, of a God whose stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob would make a way when there was no way. Stories of grace and forgiveness in the face of human frailty. Maybe when they looked up, exhausted at the end of a day's work, they remembered that they were made of the stuff of stars. They were more than the work they did. They were made in the image of God. But that memory was not enough to prevail against the power of the surrounding culture. And it seems as our stories unfold, they sacrificed their story and thereby identity just to survive. But we can't survive without stories. We need story to help shape our identity, to give us purpose, connection, and meaning. We need to claim the life-giving and challenging dimensions of our stories, our personal stories, our faith stories, congregational and beyond. That's why this story of Exodus is remembered. And that's why we're going to spend time on it. We're going to go off the lectionary. We're just going to spend, believe it or not, weeks going through this story of Exodus. It is so important that we know it, that we feel that shift, that we sense the reality of it. And remember that that Passover story is recited every year by faithful families throughout the generations. It's echoed in our communion liturgy. It's held in the heart of faithful people across the generations. This is the story that's remembered and retold so it can restore all who hear. It can give them a story of God's presence, of God's provision, and God's unfailing love that calls us into not just any old relationship, but covenantal, interconnected relationship. It's no wonder that we eat breakfast made by a loving grandmother, only to find that we are connected to the whole world. And when we think about that and think about that in covenant relationship, it makes a difference. It makes demands on us, and it challenges the power of the pyramid that lives this day, ancient and current. It calls us to remember, to be restored. The birth pangs have begun. It's a 400-year labor. Anybody up for the call? I mean, Jessica's sure glad it wasn't. Susie, you're glad it wasn't 400 years, 400 hours, 400 minutes was plenty enough, right? But there's another, that those birth pangs will bring us into a new way, a new life beyond enslavement and toil, and for us beyond the enslaving and exploitation that is unseen in our lives. This is hope beyond fear, that there is another way, a way of relationship with God and one another that is life-giving and blessed for all. The baby's ready. The story is ready to be birthed into your life. Take a breath. Take another breath. Keep breathing and don't push. Amen.